Welcome, everyone. Thank you for participating. I see many friends here, and I see some people who will be new friends, and we still got people coming in. Um, this meeting is going to be a chance for the Tigers minor league report, Grand Panjandrums, to show off their expertise. I guarantee they have it. I do not pretend to be objective since I know the guys and I like their stuff. But their stuff is the best out there on the Tigers. Now, I will say it's easier to do a great job on one team than it is to do 30 teams. So I'm not dissing Keith Law or the prospectus guys or the Fangraphs people or whatever, but this is still the best stuff out there. They are both on top of it. Um, I guess daily. I mean, I don't want to say hourly, but they're on top of it practically daily during the season, and they have good judgment. Too often I find that single team blogs or things like that are the people end up being homers because they're so much fans as well as analysts. I don't know if Rogelio and Chris are homers, but their analysis is really sharp. And if you haven't tuned into their site recently, they had about 3 weeks ago maybe an
Yeah,
exclusive 45-minute interview with Scott Harris, which is a feather in their caps, although they're not wearing caps today. So I it's a big deal when you can get the Tigers president of baseball operations in the off season to sit down and talk with you guys. And it was a nice interview. Harris, of course, Harris is a great interview. I mean, ever since he came here, he's been knocking them out of the park. He knows how to handle the media. Even when he doesn't want to answer the question, he's a good interview. Um, I saw him at a lunch at the Detroit Athletic Club. You know, I was invited by a friend of mine who's a member, and Harris took a bunch of tough questions. This is his first spring, and he didn't even answer a bunch of them, and yet no one was grumbling because he was so good at it. Okay, so Rogelio Castillo and Chris Brown. I'm going to let them talk about Tigers minor league report. Here, I just want you to talk about what you do and how people can tune in and what kind of new products you're going to offer this year. And then at 15 after, we'll start talking Tigers uh, bonus babies. Okay.
all right. First and foremost, thank you for having us this afternoon for SABR Day 2025. This is my fourth one, I believe, that I've participated or been part of. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. So Chris and I have been running Tigers ML Report in some way, shape, or form since 2019. We had a website up then, and then we took it down for a minute just because we weren't sure what direction to take, and then we just decided to go back up with it. And it's been Chris and I and some friends of ours that helped us out since 2022. We You can find us on YouTube at Tigers Minor League Report, and we cover just the minors. We do cover the Detroit Tigers. We started doing more of the daily coverage of the Tigers last year because I'm a member of the Baseball Writers Association, and Chris is now just newly minted member of the Baseball Association Detroit chapter now, which has now 25 members, which is I think the largest it's been according to Tom Gage. Chris, got to fill in the blanks on the rest where they can
Yeah,
find
well,
us.
first,
Yeah,
first of all, Gary, thank you very much for the kind words. We appreciate that. That's very nice of you. And yeah, and Raj mentioned it. We've kind of been singularly focused on the Tigers and the Tigers minor leagues since about 2019 was when we formed the Tigers minor league report with two other buddies of ours. And I had been covering the minor leagues through a site called Town for the previous 3 or 4 years. But that was kind of winding down. The other two guys there were had kids and just couldn't do it as much anymore. And we were, I wouldn't say younger, but we were more eager, I think. And yeah, really, I think what helped us was we just started posting a lot of clips on Twitter, lots and lots of clips of Tigers players doing things, and that got us a lot of attention. And we were able to parlay that into people coming to the website, and then we tried to provide scouting reports as best we could, and we went out to as many games as we could, and it's kind of grown incrementally every year since. We've kind of become known within the organization. Some of the minor league affiliates are very friendly with us now, which helps. And I think they appreciate the promotion and the attention. And we heard from Scott Harris himself that the Tigers appreciate that we're trying to educate the fans So it's been fun, and yeah, like I said, it's just grown a little bit every year, and we're hoping to continue that going forward.
Yeah, it helps a lot when the Tigers system is full of prospects, right? It makes the coverage
Yes.
a lot easier
Yeah.
because you don't have
Yeah.
to write so much critical stuff, and the system is now so exciting. Um, I wasn't planning on doing this, but it's not 12:15. I want to ask you a question. What did you think of ESPN rating three of the Tigers prospects in the top nine because they included um, the Japanese pitcher in there? So they're really rating nine prospects, and they put McGonigal in there, which I thought was overrating him, but I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, I think McGonigal has one of the best hitting tools I've seen out there. He just the percentages show for themselves, and I know Kylie McDaniel can be a little. He's not as tough. Keith Law, I think, is a lot tougher than the Tigers for whatever reason. He just is with the Tigers, but I think McGonigal of the ones he mentioned, I think is worth the hype because just the amount of just the fact that in Lakeland, just seeing him, and Chris and I have talked about this, the fact he was kind of almost playing with the pitching, like he knew it was coming. He has a very good eye at the plate. It was unfortunate he got that hand injury last year because I would have really he got off to a slow start at West Michigan, but I still think that he was going to come out and do well. And the fact that for his age and doing what he's doing, I think is impressive. For being his size, I think he shows ability that he could play. I think long term he's a second baseman, but I don't know, Chris. For me, he's just been one of those guys that he just immediately shows that like plate discipline so quickly that it just doesn't. I don't want to say like I said, maybe toying maybe a strong thing, but it just I don't know. And lately, he just didn't seem like he was challenged. He's like, all right, I'm over this.
Yeah, I mean, as we said, we've been doing this for a while, and he is the best pure hitter that I've seen in terms of a prospect for the Tigers, and that includes Riley Green and Colt Keith, two guys that we really loved coming through the system. He just
And Spencer
has,
Torkelson?
yeah, well, yes, he's a much better pure hitter than Spencer Torkelson, yes, and part of it is, he's a smaller guy, but he's not, he's well built, so he's like probably 5'10", 5'8", sometimes they fudge those heights. You usually subtract an inch or two, but he's well built. He's got short arms, and he really knows how to rotate. He really stays in the strike zone. He doesn't swing and miss. So there's like all the modern elements that you want from a hitter he has. And as Raj mentioned, he's an above average runner. He's playing shortstop now. Most people think that he won't be a shortstop at the big league level, but just because the Tigers will have, or theoretically they should have somebody who's better at shortstop, but he probably can play shortstop at the big league level, in a fill-in basis. And then so you got an up the middle defender who has a hit tool that could challenge for batting titles one day. So he doesn't necessarily have the cathedral ceiling of Max Clark, who could be, if he grows into more power, could be a true five tool monster. But the floor on McGonigal is very, very high, and it's a fun argument to have between McGonigal and Clark. And he's a consensus top 25 prospect in baseball right now. I don't think he's outside of the top 25 on any list that's been released so far.
Yeah, I wouldn't be I wouldn't arch my eyebrow over a top 25, but top 10 I arch my eyebrow over. I saw the headline, I said, "What?" Besides Job and Clark, I said, "Who?" I figured it must have been him, but I still was surprised. Anyway, all right. So do you guys want to say anything else about TMLR before we launch into the formal program?
Oh yeah. So just letting people know this year what new products we have. We do have a Patreon that admittedly we're gonna be putting more content behind the paywall because we just feel like it's time to kind of we do want to make a little bit extra money, but we also want to do more go to more games this year as far as like go to the South Bend, get a chance to go to Erie more often. But it's also we get some requests for Midwest League games as well in other parts like Great Lakes. There was even somebody was asking about us going to Wisconsin at some point too as well. So because Midwest League coverage is kind of not a forte with some of the prospect side of the thing. So, but you can find our Patreon. We have two tiers: the extra $2 one, the VIP one. We're gonna be doing some more video content for that this year. And also, we're gonna be doing like watch-alongs. We noticed last year they did pretty well, where people just hung out with us and watched the minor league game and shoot the breeze with us, and that was a lot of fun. And we look forward to doing more of those kind of type of content games where we're sitting at home anyways watching the game, or sometimes we'll be at the ballpark, and so people ask us questions anyways. And we have a Discord, so if you're familiar with Slack or a Messenger, we just have people talking baseball all day in there.
And the only other thing I'll add is that we are in the process of rolling out our own, top 40 prospects of the system. And we talked with Gary before. You probably don't need to go to 40, but that's just kind of the way we've done it is Rogelio, Jerry, and myself. We made a list of like top 40, 45 or whatever, and then just everybody who fit on the list we put in there. But we were providing, 2-3 paragraphs about each player, describing them, and you can kind of glean from that how much of a prospect these players are. But that's it's all on the Patreon right now, and it's going to be out for wide release, as it were, in the next week or so.
Yep, correct.
All right. So if you're interested in Tigers prospects, that'll be there for you.
Okay. All right, great. So I recommend everyone check it out at least and see what they have. And I think you'll be pleased if you're a Tigers fan, especially if you're going to follow them, live and die with them day by day this year, because so many of these guys are going to be in Detroit sometime soon. Although I suppose it's always possible if the Tigers get off to a good start with the crew at the major league level, some of these guys won't get much playing time in the majors. But I think, I like the fact that Harris is aggressive about promoting these guys and not doesn't often bring in essentially broken down reclamation project veterans to fill slots when you got a prospect you could give playing time to. Okay. All right. So 12-17. The only other note I want to make, if you see me looking down, I'm not looking at my phone unless my phone chirps, which it shouldn't. I'm actually taking notes the old-fashioned way with a pen. So I know what to do afterward or things like have to follow up on. I don't want anyone to think I'm not paying attention. Okay, so I'm going to turn the meeting over to Rogelio and Chris. I'm going to let them talk about anything they want that's PG rated. And they can take questions whenever they want. And we're going to give them until 1:30, maybe a little bit later, depending on how many people we have and how much there is to say. Okay, guys, take it away.
All right, thanks. So Chris, do you want to just start with like kind of the history? We should go back because we just did the history piece, so maybe we can start from there.
Yeah, and I'll say that people, if you have a question at any time or a comment, feel free to chime in. We like to do this kind of conversationally. I don't think we prepared a presentation for you, as it were. But yeah, we discussed what we wanted to talk about regarding this, and we thought this was the appropriate audience to kind of begin with the history of Tigers prospects, because the overarching point is that right now is probably the best the system has ever been. And we can talk about the late 70s a little bit down the road, but Rogelio just wrote a history piece going back through the Baseball Cube is a very nice resource for online that has Baseball America's top 100 lists going back to 1990 and the top 10 organizational lists going back to 1983, I think. And so we can kind of use that and go back and compare what the system looks like right now to what it has in the past. And I don't know if you want to talk about some of your findings from that, Raj, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So, and I put the link in the story in our chat as well, so everybody can take a kind of maybe perhaps follow along. But what was interesting is that if you look back at some of the Tigers, the 1984 roster was built primarily, and the 68 roster, of course, is different because the draft wasn't instilled till 1965. And then, I mean, essentially the old farm systems where I think it was, I believe, from 1942 until 1962, where they had, you're talking 6 classes of minor league baseball. You have your AAA, A, B, C, and D. And at one point, I believe it was in 61 or 1960, the Tigers had, I believe, up to 10 teams in the minor leagues. So it was just it was kind of chaotic in a sense, but you had Bill Freehand, who was in Denver, Jake Wood, who was the first African-American player who came all the way through the Tiger system. So the first kind of African-American prospect. And so Denver was a kind of a stopping point until until the late 60s. And then it just, after that though, when you saw the core of the 84 Tigers built, it was built on really 4 different draft classes in the 70s. And Bill Campbell did a really excellent job of building between him and Bill Joyce. Jim Campbell. I'm sorry, Jim Campbell did a really good job of building out this farm system. And the Tigers really were, I guess I'm not necessarily. I look at this as, I know that team building back then was different. You built with the farm system. Free agency wasn't a thing. But the Tigers seemed like they were ahead of the curve already with that, and they were getting players out of their system that were producing relatively quickly. And so it stands out because you have the ability to draw from not only the June draft, but then back then, which was the January draft. And so they got a couple players from that ended up working out pretty well for them. And case in point was Steve Kemp and Tommy Brookins. And so there wasn't a quote unquote Tiger way that we could find. It's just like everybody thinks was the Cardinals or the Dodgers and even the Pirates then. I mean, both the Dodgers and Pirates were doing really well in developing players internationally. The Tigers weren't really going that way at the time. And I think there's a couple of factors that play into it. I'm sure Gary and some other people can test that, perhaps lack of money or lack of funding, if you will, in those resources. But the Tigers, for a while, even if you look at some of the draft classes in the 70s, were really hyper local too. They were really trying to find best players around in the state, but they started kind of going away from that a little bit. And so the biggest thing that I noticed though was, after 1979, 1980, it just dropped in terms of like just the matter of, you can argue Sparky Anderson didn't have patience with rookies. And you can argue that there's a lot of things, there's a lot of factors that play into that some of it was before from my time, but I know researching this is that Sparky really favored veterans. And the Howard Johnson trade comes to mind for veteran pitching. They tried any prospect that wasn't nailed down. Essentially, they traded for pitching. And so looking at some of these early top 10 prospect rankings for the Tigers, it is I'm not trying to sound harsh, but it is a barren. It is a wasteland of just guys who woulda, shoulda, coulda, never. I mean, when Scott Eldred is your first player to come up with the first top 100 prospect list for Baseball America in 1990, that was a prelude of things to come.
It was interesting that I've done a whole bunch of deep dives into draft stuff before, but when the Tigers started getting really bad again there in the late teens and got multiple first overall picks, I was kind of looking at the history of draft and which positions to look at. And you can kind of look league wide. It seems like nobody really knew what they were doing in the draft until about 1980, which is kind of funny that the Tigers were ahead of the curve there. And Raj touched on it. I mean, it was the 74 draft. They took Lance Parrish first overall, right? Or not first overall, but their first round pick. And they also got Mark Fidrich in the 10th round, I want to say.
Yeah, that's right.
And then they followed up in 75 with who did they get in 75? Was that the Thompson?
That was
year?
so that Thompson draft is Jason Thompson was a 4th round draft pick. And then Lou Whitaker was the next round.
Yeah.
After that.
And then in 76 is arguably the greatest single draft in baseball history when the Tigers took Alan Trammell, Dan Petrie, Jack Morris, and Ozzie Smith. But they, of course, could not sign Ozzie Smith over. I think that the argument there was a sum of about $10,000. The Tigers wouldn't pony up. But baseball doesn't really change that much. But so yeah, and then was 77 was not much, but 78 was Kirk Gibson, and that was kind of the core of that 84 team that Rogelio was talking about. And it is often the case when we talk about these things, off air, as it were. Roger's writing his article, and I was going to add a piece to it, and then it kind of spiraled out of control into my own article about how those players from that 84 team, when they were, in the minors, how they would have been ranked as prospects. And I wish I could present you my findings, but I'm kind of right in the middle of it. But it's interesting to apply kind of today's standards to what would have, those prospects back in the day, because a lot of these guys were, end up being great players, but you can look and Lance Parrish for his first 3 years in the minors didn't do much of anything. And then he finally hit, I want to say he was 21 and hit 25 home runs. And it was like, okay, now that's a prospect. But what you see is a lot of guys who developed in the major leagues before they really figured out who they were. Like Jack Morris did not have a great pro debut in the minors. It was like a 6 ERA, and Dan Petrie was a really young kid. So things have changed in that regard. But one of the things I really wanted to get across just from the general prospect rankings is it's just so much better now than it used to be. And I don't hold that against anybody who was doing this 20, 30, 40 years ago. Obviously, there was, the resources were not there at all. I've heard many times where, you couldn't even find out the results of the draft unless you called Major League Baseball. So, the resources are so much better now, but basically, 30, 40 years ago, all you had to go on was stats and maybe some draft status. And things are just, they've continually gotten better. Baseball America was kind of the originator of these prospect ranking lists. But over the last 20 years, there have been a number of other really good outlets for this. And so there's so much more coverage now. You've got people like us who are more focused on, one team, and the resources are just so much better. We've got video now. We have a fuller understanding of what makes players good and what makes them not as good. You can go back 10, 15 years ago, and anybody who threw a 100-mile-an-hour fastball was getting drafted in the top 10 picks. And now we know that doesn't really matter much. The Ryan Perry could throw very hard, but it turns out he wasn't a very good player, because there are other things that we can measure now, and those have filtered out to the sort of public analysts like us now. So all of which is to say that the fact that the Tigers have a very highly ranked system right now, I think, is even more impressive, because the general quality of these lists is just so much better now that it's probably more reflective of the truth than it ever has been.
And to add to that too, one of the things that we found out early on when we started going to games and getting more intel was we would talk to a player before, and this is the conversation we go. So what did the Tigers have you doing? Oh, I don't know. Just tell me to play my game. Okay. And it was just kind of puzzling, because you would hear from about other organizations that they had nutrition plans, or they had certain things they're working on. And then, we would hear things like, Tiger Scouts would leave after the 4th inning, just kind of like weird things that were like random. We were like, and then sometimes we'd see David Littlefield running around, and it was just little organization chaos. And then I think it was 2 years ago during Media Day. When it was Media Day, Scott Harris's first full season taken, or maybe it was last year. I can't remember which one it was, but Isaac Pacheco. It was Isaac Pacheco and
Chase Young.
Yeah, Chase Young. And the biggest thing they were like, their mood instantly changed was nutrition, that they were eating better. They were eating actually clean protein and chicken and things that didn't sound like hot and readies. And it was a different tone to, even when I had a chance to speak to Kaiser Montero, and I was fortunate enough to, thanks to Carlos Guillen from the Tigers, to his Spanish a little different than mine. But basically, the Tigers put everything in Spanish for him, and that made him an effective pitcher. And I paused and I thought about this for a second, because I realized Al Avila being Cuban, that you would think that would be something that was already in place, and it wasn't. And it blew my mind. And so doing the little things like that, and Ryan Garco deserves a lot of the credit as well for you're hearing things like individual player plans, and where a lot of times, speaking in 2023 and 2024, a lot of the conversations that we had with pitchers, they were telling us that, like, for example, Brant Herter, they were like, yeah, you know what, we want you to work on this changeup, or we want you to work on this pitch. And if you notice, like, the biggest thing that Chris and I try to do is notice little changes in swing mechanics and those things. Even Jim Jarvis, who's on our top list, for example, he's already changed his swing from Lakeland to West Michigan. When Ty Madden was drafted, the biggest thing was about his fastball, whether his fastball was going to be consistent. And he was Kevin abilities. He was getting murdered by lefties. I mean, it took him a while before that's still not the case, but either way, they changed the mechanics on his windup. There's been things that been like, why Jackson Jobe didn't throw his cutter in the MLB. There's a specific rhyme and reason for everything, and that's something that the Tigers have never done, never. And I say that with full confidence because just based off the fact that it wasn't until Randy Smith. I mean, reading that former GM Randy Smith, it was the first time the Tigers brought computers in. This is like 1996, in an era that, yes, computers are not what they were then as they are now, but the fact that they had bare minimum scouting. They were one of the last teams when MLB played, I believe it was in 1990, 1991, to have the minimum of minor league teams. Things were done cheap for a while, but when organizations were mining international talent or just doing whatever they were doing to get ahead, if you look at the Braves in the 90s where with Leo Mazzoni and the pitching mechanics and John Smoltz basically saying he didn't become John Smoltz until the Braves taught him how to be a better pitcher. You never heard stories about that with the Tigers, and now you're hearing that for the first time. And that's why I feel confident saying that, because there wasn't much instruction given, and there seems to be a system in place for that.
Yeah, I mean, the way we've kind of characterized it is it almost felt for years there that the Tigers treated the minor leagues as kind of like a gauntlet, like a just a testing ground for if these players could make it through that with the minimal resources they had, then maybe they could be a good big leaguer. Like if they had that extra drive. And I think a lot of players probably fell by the wayside because they didn't have any kind of support. And Raj touched on it. You could go into the locker room after a game in West Michigan in 2015, 2016, and their post-game meal is a dozen hot and ready pizzas. And yeah, now they have, salads and chefs and muscle milk and all these other things. But a lot of it is just they're investing in their minor leaguers now. They actually are trying to produce better players. And it's every single player. It's not just the Jackson Jobes or the bonus babies, if you will, the $1 million players. They're looking at every single player and figuring out how they can make them better. And, in a lot of cases, it doesn't lead to big leaguers, but it leads to better minor leaguers. And you used to call them the guys who were paid to play catch with the prospects. Well, now they're legitimately good baseball players. They're just maybe not Major League Baseball players, but it's reflected in the minor league winning percentage, which, it'd be one thing if they just stocked the minors with a bunch of 28-year-old veterans. They have a lot of younger players and a lot of actual prospects, and they keep winning at every level in the minors. Last year, they had the best winning percentage of any organization in minor league baseball when you combine all the teams. And it's because they're caring about it. And so it's been really fun to cover this kind of transformation over the last 3 or 4 years. And it's made it, you can kind of count on every year a handful of players coming from nowhere, just making these huge developmental leaps. A couple of years ago, it was Justice Bigby, who is, kind of fallen back to earth. Development's not particularly, people like to say it's not linear, right? People take steps up and then, disappear again. But, other guys, Kyler Montero was a big developmental win. Sawyer Gibson Long is one of the biggest ones that they've had. And that's, he kind of fell off the radar a little bit because he got hurt. But he was kind of an afterthought, really. It was Al Avila's final trade, I believe, before he was fired, was getting Sawyer Gibson Long from the Twins for Michael Fulmer.
Yeah,
I believe.
Yeah, that's correct.
And he was 24, 25 at the time and not much of a prospect. And they didn't even protect him on their 40-man or the 40-man roster for the Rule 5 draft that winter. And nobody took him because nobody thought much of him. And then the next year, the Tigers had a plan for him and he executed it flawlessly. He added several pitches. And by the end of the year, he's up in the big league, striking out 11 batters, I think, against the Angels. And it was just, they've managed to find a way to improve players that's really encouraging just for the future for the organization.
And we've been objective before in the past. I mean, we've been told that sometimes we're quote unquote too mean, but in reality, I call, a spade a spade. And the system for a while, even, if going back to, I want to go back to the past for a moment here. We're talking, it's, here we are in 1983. You have your top prospect in Mike Laga, who's hitting the ball. In really simple numbers, he's hitting the ball hard. He's hitting home runs. I still think I believe he has the Tigers minor league record for most home runs in a season down in Evansville, just mashing the ball. So you look at his numbers, you're like, oh, this should translate. It never translated. And Lagos ended up training, I believe, for Mike Heath, I want to say. I think he was treated for Mike Heath. I'm not 100% about that one. But, you look at guys like Nelson Simmons and Bob Melvin, who became bigger elsewhere. And, I always think of we talked about this before. I was trying to remember his name, and Gary helped me remember it was Ricky Barlow, who spent pretty much the entire 80s in the minor leagues because he couldn't strike out anybody. Again, I know strikeouts and those kind of things are the game has changed. But if you think about the sense that the Tigers could not produce a strikeout type pitcher outside of Justin Thompson until Justin Verlander, really in the 2004, when you had Dwight Gooden. I mean, I know some of these guys are like superstars, but I mean, Cleveland had their rotation of Charles Nash. Cleveland had a really good rotation, homegrown rotation. The White Sox, as you remember in the early 90s, Jack McDowell, Wilson Alvarez, Alex Hernandez. Everybody had some sort of good rotation. Tigers, it was like tumbleweeds. I mean, Scott Sander, like Felipe Lira as an example, Jose Lima. Lima got better somewhere else. He got better in Houston as an example. It was just a lot of those. That's why you can, fundamentally speaking, even as much as the Tigers tried, Seth Gredinger, Mike Drumright, it just, there was no kind of course of action with these guys. It was just like, well, we'll see what happens here. I mean, and we also have, I wrote an article how dumb it was to pick Matt Anderson #1 overall. I mean, who picks a reliever out of all things? I mean, even then, if you look at the body of work of Rice University, all their pitchers were always overpitched. And that's not a Captain Hindsight kind of thing. That was facts even then. And, Kenny Ball never worked out. But anyway, I digress. It took the Tigers, now are even spending money on the minor league facility, which they haven't spent since the 70s, since the early 70s, folks. And as much as people want to complain about the fans want to complain they haven't spent money, they're spending money where you can't see it, and that's in the minor leagues. And it's showing based off the results here. A player that comes to mind too, that I mentioned earlier, is Brant Herter. Brant Herter, did not appear on any prospect radars at all. He was high on ours because we saw him all the time, and he was a guy who went up there and pitched some big innings last year in September and was really good because the Tigers recognized something about him where he was essentially becoming a 2-pitch guy, and they added him to have the 3rd pitch. That's an example of scouting the line, or not just looking beyond the box score, but looking at something and trying to adjust it and to make him effective. The pitching chaos last year was fueled. The quote-unquote pitching chaos, I should say, was fueled by all these guys because the Tigers were able to identify and do something that we've heard other teams do. When you see that Tommy, the guy they just signed, Canley?
Yep.
Canley, throws 60 changeups in a row. Tigers weren't doing that before. Now they're doing stuff like that. They're doing things. They're having pitching design, pitching command. And so I think that for every time you hear somebody complain about the free agency side of things, think about this. Yes, the Tigers may be cheapskates when it comes to signing free agents. They spent quite a bit of money this year, depending on who you ask. But if you look at a franchise like Cleveland, who doesn't spend a lot of money, but they are a development machine for the last 25, even go back 30 years, where Cleveland has always been competitive. Why? Because they were able to develop their own players and put a product out there that wasn't laughable. When you have Scott Sanders and there's just so many jokes about the pitching, but I mean, you can't prop up Kevin Ritz as your next big thing and expect results.
That I have to say, I don't want to interrupt, but I have to say that it's such a dreary assessment, although I didn't find anything you guys said was wrong because I'm old enough to remember all that. The Tigers were just awful at player development. Bill Joey once said in the late 80s because the Tigers were lagging behind adding pitching coaches and hitting coaches at every level. And he said, we don't want to wipe their noses for them. If they survive and get to like AAA, I think they had a batting pitching coach at AAA, get to AAA, like we'll help them out. But otherwise, it's just sink or swim. We don't give a shit, which is the most idiotic attitude you can imagine. Anyway, thanks for letting me interrupt on that.
Yeah. No, one of the great tragedies for me, because I was born in 1980, and so a lot of those early 90s Tigers teams were, what I was watching. My first memories were about 87, but some of the most enjoyable offenses the Tigers have ever produced, and some of the worst pitching you've ever seen. And it's a real bummer because those teams were putting up 7, 8, 9, 10 runs a game and still barely scraping around 500. But I did want to kind of circle back to something that Rogelio mentioned. He talked about Cleveland, constantly producing players, and I think that's because they have a development philosophy. And you see other teams, and you can kind of pick up on it watching who they draft and who they sign in the international market. And the Tigers used to have one under Dave Dombrowski and Alavila, and it was generally considered that they were just going to take hard-throwing SEC pitchers. In that, it worked for them a little bit, I guess. And when one thing, what's kind of been impressive about a lot of the development that's going on is this is the current development staff improving players taken under Alavila and David Chad and Dave Littlefield in the previous regime, who's, I don't think that their drafting and development philosophies were aligned. And I feel like it's much more in sync now, where we've only had 2 drafts with Scott Harris and Mark Connor, but it's pretty easy to see what they're targeting. They're targeting athletic, up the middle defenders who can hit. That's Max Clark at center field. That's Kevin McGonigal at second base shortstop. It's Bryce Rayner at shortstop. And even beyond that, it's all the other players they've taken in later rounds. Brett Callahan's a center fielder. Jackson Strong's a center fielder. Jim Jarvis, John Peck. These are all second baseman shortstops with interesting traits. And so I'm kind of curious to see where this goes in the next few years once they start developing the players that they're actually targeting rather than the players that they were given. And the other aspect of that is seeing more development of the international players that they're acquiring, because even the last two, 3 classes, unfortunately, the international market, it's very exploitative, and some of these guys are getting signed when they're 12 and 13. So I don't even know if the players that they're agreeing with now are Scott Harris targets or Alavila targets or what, but they seem to have a real organizational philosophy now, and it's going to start. I guess you've kind of seen it a little bit at the big league level, right? Like they became, toward the end of last year, they became a much more aggressive base running team. They really believe in catching the ball in the outfield, which is good. So yeah, I mean that's one of the aspects, the positive aspects we've seen. And I promise we're not going to be 100% sunshine and roses here. We could we're going to. I'd probably talk about some prospects that we're not crazy about before too long, but I just wanted to touch on that last aspect because I do think that the philosophy is coming along.
Yeah, I mean, and before we get to our list a little bit and talk about the guys on our list too, I mean, getting back to the international thing for a moment, I mean, Ramon Pena, the scout who scouted Bobby Higginson and Omar Infante, and I think he had a role with also Juan Encarnacion. That was it. The Tigers, to me, as a player, as a son of a immigrant, my father being from Cuba and being a big baseball guy, growing up, there wasn't a lot of players that, I mean, I know everybody talks about Barrio Garbe, great play-by-play guy, I've gotten to know him in the last few years, but that was really it. And now you see a guy who on our list that we're going to talk about in a little while, Brian Bader,
Fred Gerber Montilla.
The Mantilla. Thank you, Chris. I'm Hispanic and I can't say Hispanic names correctly. That is a shame, and I know that. But my whole thing is that those are, like, for example, he's off to a really good start right now, and that is something to be said. Where unlike Dave Dombrowski, who, if there was an international player that was like 17, but a team like, for example, the Rays saw something in why am I drawing a blank sudden on his name? Willie Adames.
Willie Adames, yeah.
Yeah, they saw something and they were able to poach him. Same thing with the Reds or Eduardo Suarez. Same thing. Like, it was now I don't think the swindling of that's going to happen anymore, because I think the Tigers are going to keep these guys around a little longer, because it's not they're identifying the international talent better, and I think that's important, because you need those kind of victories, and if you're going to spend that kind of money, obviously you want some return on your investment, and not just hard throwing relievers. Yes, we can talk about the Fernando Rodney who broke through, and Rodney got better after he left, if in case you didn't notice, because a team identified a weakness and made him a better pitcher.
Yeah, well, and I don't want to gloss over something that you mentioned earlier that I think does need more scrutiny. As you mentioned, Ricardo Montero took off once they translated his instructions into Spanish, and this is Ryan Garco told us this was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So there was nothing like that going on for these young Latino players, and geez, big shocker, they didn't have any homegrown starters since what was it? Was it Jose Lima? Felipe Lira?
Yeah, Felipe Lira, yeah.
So almost 25, 30 years they went without having a homegrown Latin-born player
Who threw a complete game.
I mean, you had Gregory Soto, who was a solid reliever, and you mentioned Fernando Rodney, and they had some other guys, but they weren't investing. It just is like a huge blind spot for the organization. And again, that's another thing that we've seen improve. Suddenly, some of their top 10, top 20 prospects now are kids coming up from the Latin development program, and they're legit. They're good players, and that wasn't the case, for most of the last 30 years.
Yeah, and that's a thing where I think, and again, not trying to bash Avila, but I feel like that's a weird blind spot to me, because he was the one that brought over Livan Hernandez, was instrumental in that, and understood that even the Marlins were doing some sort of international development with guys like Edgar Renteria as well, and they had a couple other players that came to mind. But astonishing with the Tigers, it just didn't. I mean, and you mentioned Paredes in the chat. Paredes, well, we've heard some weirdly weird things about Paredes in the minors that if you ever see us at a game, we can always discuss afterwards. But it is interesting. It is interesting that how Avila handled the international side of things, and I never understood it. Like, the more I heard about it, the more I was kind of perplexed, because as somebody that you understand, like, if you speak Spanish and you want to be in a comfortable setting, like we were talking to Roberto Campos, for example, last year, and his environment in West Michigan has been nothing but supportive. He's been around people he's familiar with. They brought his family up here. They've done everything they can. Versus when we were talking to a former reliever, Anthony Castro, and talking to Soto beforehand, it was kind of like they were on their own. They were really on their own. So the organization seems like that's much more involved in getting these players assimilated and in a more comfortable setting. They're building a new Dominican academy down, which I think will be. I'm not sure when the open date will be, but that's a really cool thing to see, and that is something that I think it's just going to benefit them down the road and give them a better reputation, which is probably why they've lost out on guys, because if you think about the I always bring up the Pirates, because the Pirates, like, for example, they have a big scouting emphasis on Taiwanese players, and the Tigers are now starting to get more in the Asian market, a market they have again ignored for a while now, and now they're getting talk about having scouts in that market for the first time, and so they're going to go do no churn, no stone unturned, unlike going to Flint or again, nothing going wrong against local players, but it seemed like the organizational philosophy of the past was just seemed to be cheap and lazy. And that is as much as that might sound like an asshole thing to say, that's, as a teenager, like I said, and I'm just a year. I was born in 1981. I've been watching baseball for a long time, and reading the Detroit news, and you hear Lynn Henning getting all sunny about Nate Cornejo and all these things. And I'm just sitting there going, what am I missing here? What am I missing here? And even at a young age, being kind of aware of that. And when I found out there's blogs and those things that talk about farm systems, and I'm sitting there screaming in my lungs going, this system has sucked. What is going on? Like, it's like, it just, but everybody was so obsessed with the Tigers winning in 06, and that's great. And I was excited too. I'm sorry to get my voice up about being a fan there for a moment, but again, it's just, but then you look at teams after that, the Tigers struggled, in 07, 08, you could have been wondered what if they had more minor league depth to them. And they had other players involved in that too, where they didn't have to spend much money. I'm glad, don't get me wrong, Miguel Cabrera being here in a Tigers uniform was fantastic. But you have to wonder if they had a player development machine similar like the Braves did or the Cleveland did, what they wouldn't have to spend so much money on those things. So
and I think this is that Gary asking, do you think the real blame for lack of support was on Littlefield? I think that's probably an astute observation, given that Tom Moore was the head of their Latin development program before, and he's still there. And that's one of the things I give Scott Harris credit for is he didn't come in and blow everybody out and just install his own people. He kept a lot of people in the organization, and there are a lot of people who are talented. It's I guess just the fish rots from the head down or whatever. So they got rid of the top guys, but we don't want to bury Dave Littlefield too much, but he's kind
David Chad deserves some blame too.
There's sort of some infamous time when he was a GM in Pittsburgh, and I don't know if necessarily player development was his strength, such as it was.
Yeah, I mean, and if you look, and here's the thing too, it was becoming predictable. Again, it's not even being cocky or conceited about this, but when we would do our draft show, and I made a prediction they were going to draft Trey Cruz. Why? Because he's the son of a former league player, and Tigers had notoriously had a history of picking players from Texas or Rice in that the Great Plains area. Because David Chad, you always could tell a David Chad pick if it was from Creighton or Oklahoma, like clockwork. I mean, Andrew Avogado, Oklahoma State University. So there's these in LSU. Al Avila was friends with the manager at LSU, the former manager. You can tell that it was like clockwork. It was predictable, and it was really sad that two guys in their in their basements, quote unquote, could predict a draft pretty amateurly, and that was sad. Now you don't have to do that anymore. We have a team a development team that's doing things that major league teams should be doing in the first place.
And one other little thing on the international market that I think the Tigers are doing that's kind of smart, and they've always done this, is they've really leaned into Venezuela. It's one of the two big international markets anyway, along with the Dominican Republic. But the Tigers have some of the most prominent, best Venezuelan baseball players ever in their organization. Miguel Cabrera, Maglio Ordonez, Carlos Guillen, Anibal Sanchez. They've had a lot of well-known Venezuelan players, and so I think the Tigers brand plays better down there, and they're leaning into that. Now, Venezuela is a tough place to scout, and there's a lot of rough things going on there, but they're bringing, Major League Baseball has kind of brought a lot of those guys to academies in the Dominican Republic now to make it easier, but that's, just kind of leaning into your built-in strengths, if you will, and they're doing a lot of that. And we like to notice trends in the draft. They've been scouting the Northeast particularly well. They had a really nice stretch in the sort of Four Corners area where they got a lot of kind of under the radar prospects who ended up being pretty solid. Like Bo Brisky was a 27th rounder. I think he was pitching in Colorado somewhere. And Wilmer Flores, who's had a very up and down prospect career so far, but he was at a junior college in Arizona. So they've got some really nice area scouts going for him too, and that's nice to see.
Yeah, and you can tell, there's a very good flavor to that. Even Tarek Skubal was in a school in Arizona that was scouted, and whoever scouted that area picked him up when he was at Seattle University. So they're checking in, and you're hearing more about we're hearing more about the relationship the scouts have with their players whereas before we didn't really hear that. I mean, I don't know about you, Chris. I don't remember ever hearing anybody talk about the relationship they have with their scout, or was Doug McCavish yelling at us in Toledo either?
That was one of the things that we talked about Scott Harris about is under the previous regimes, they would take high school players. They would take talented high school players, but almost exclusively in the top round or the top 3 or 4 rounds. Riley Green, Jackson Jobe, going back to Nick Castellanos. But after that, they just kind of went exclusively college guys. And what you see now is they're taking high school players in the 11th round, the 19th round. It's kind of, what they did long ago, but they're actually, you could tell the scouts have relationships with these guys because they're signing them. And normally those high school players are going to go off to college, but they're signing these guys for 25 grand over the minimum 50 grand. Like they're finding these kids that they believe in who also want to play pro ball. That's just something they didn't do before. Last year they took 3 junior college players, which was the most of any team. So it feels like they're really ramping up scouting on the amateur side too, which is another positive development.
Yeah, and the Cole Keefe signing too was one of those things where there was at that point Avila was bringing in the new guys, and Keefe was kind of like one of those like, oh, okay, all right, fine, go ahead and it paid off.
Yeah.
But that was the first time where the analytics department and before Scott Harris came about, that the Tigers did that in a long time. And so it was interesting to see, and it's just ironic that Keith ended up being who he is now. You know, the first player to sign his long-term deal to be a Tiger for a long time that fit the kind of new motif even before Avila was fired. So it is interesting that even, you know, as we look at our top 45 here, kind of segue into that a little bit too, it's kind of reflected on the art, like the bottom half of our top 45 or 46 rather, is players that have been around in the system for a while. Whereas if you look at if you start going 20, probably anywhere, I think from 23 up, it is all the young, is kind of like where the Tigers started. You can start seeing the Avila influence of the draft. So, Chris, should we start with,
Yeah, well,
go ahead.
I guess I'll finish with one sort of general overview. We talked about, why we think the system's so good, but a lot of it is being noticed nationally. And so we've put, there have been, I mentioned there have been 5 kind of big top 100 prospect lists put out so far. You got Baseball America, you got Keith Law at The Athletic, you got MLB Pipeline, you've got ESPN with Kylie McDaniel, and you got Baseball Prospectus. The only one we're still waiting on here is Fangraphs. But I took all of those top 100 lists and compiled them and made kind of a composite top 100 list. And it actually ends up with, if you only include players who are on at least 3 of those lists, there's 92. And the Tigers have 6 of them. And on that composite list, they have Jackson Jobe, who's number 5. And again, that's Roki Sasaki is number 1. And you can choose whether you want to believe he's a prospect or not. He was a professional baseball player in Japan, but he's still young. Then you have Max Clark at 12, Kevin McGonigal at 16. So you got 3 consensus top 20 prospects. And then Bryce Rayner, their first round pick last year, is at 62. Tyron Lorenzo, the catcher that kind of Scott Harris got pilloried for settling for last year, is at 64. And then you've got Josue Briseño at 80. So they have 6 prospects in the top 100 composite list. And we can go back years and years and years. The most they've ever had on the Baseball America list is 5. They did it this year and just a couple years ago when they had the Torkelson, Skubal, Manning, Mize, Green quintet. Never more than 4 or maybe even 3 in any other year. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think the general public scouting is getting better and better. So that this is kind of why we're saying this is probably the best group they've ever had.
Yeah. And it's just because, I mean, again, if you go back to, I started doing a thing where I would look back at 10-year interval. So if you're looking at, for example, the top 10 in 1995 for the Tigers in terms of Baseball America, only Tony Clark was the only one that was featured in the top 100 at number 86. So then if you go to 2005, in terms of team prospect rankings in the top 10, you had 2 Tigers, and this is when they expanded the list to 30. And then it was Curtis Granderson and Kyle Sleeve. Granderson coming in at number 57, Kyle Sleeve at number 86, but Justin Verlander was even in the top 100. So that's just, again, this is where the list is like, well, wait a minute, like.
And I don't believe they had anybody on 2015's list.
Correct.
So.
Not one a single plot. Yeah, and then the top prospect for the Tigers in 2015 on their top 30, the top 2 players, Devon Travis played, but he was injury ridden. But he played in Toronto.
Yeah, they traded him for Anthony Gose.
Yeah, and Steven Moya, who never made it above, I believe. Oh no, he
played in the big leagues.
Yeah.
But he was such a windmill that he was gone pretty soon.
Yeah, a cup of coffee. Yeah, I forgot. He had almost like a cup of coffee. And then Buck Farmer's still around. Derek Hill, technically still around. And then it's just like I said, but then the rest of the list after that is just it's a hodgepodge of guys.
Yeah. And I should mention that they had two other players who showed up on at least one list. Jace Young, who was a consensus top 100 prospect last year, then he played in the majors and everybody kind of booted him off their top 100 list. And Jaden Ham, who was a fifth round pitcher taken in the 2023 draft. He made Keith Law's top 100. So you could argue that they have 8 top 100 prospects if you want. And there's a player that we have ranked in the system's top 5 that's not on any top 100 list. So either we're crazy or there's something going on there that we haven't seen.
Yeah, and we'll get to that player in a second, but that to me is because I know Scott Harris talking like just having a conversation about it. He's rather pissed off about it actually.
Yeah.
He talked about why, and it'll make sense why we'll present him here in a second. Why he might have legitimate beef for it, but I think the biggest thing that we've taken away from these lists too is it's not just like a simple paragraph with these guys. They're getting a lot of props because a guy like Keith Law, for example, Keith Law has been notoriously does not like the Tigers. I mean, for whatever everybody Tiger fans think that, but the proof is in the pudding. He's never been really favorable. In fact, for a guy like Jaden Ham, who doesn't throw like upper 90s, like mid 90s fastball, but he's a guy who can ride the top of the zone, does really good, a good job sequencing. It'll be interesting to see what does in Double-A this year, but I digress. That's saying something to me that if he's going to give somebody like Jaden Ham on his list, a guy who was Midwest League Pitcher of the Year, he was our minor league pitcher of the year because he can the command for his being already advanced command already. The first time I saw him in Lakeland, it was just something different about him. That speaks volumes as well among the prospect lists.
Yeah, and I think just to circle back to one other thing, when we talked about the organizational philosophy, I think Keith Law has always kind of had that Cleveland philosophy. He likes pitchers and guys who play up the middle, and the Tigers were all about basically relief arms and guys who played on the corners, and then they're moving more toward that middle. But yeah, I don't know if we want to go through and talk about these individual players, how we want to handle this, if we want to spend a bunch of time on each player or just kind of.
Yeah, or if anybody has any questions too, we'd love to take some questions right now, and we can take some questions as we go through our top 46 list here that we have not announced publicly. So you guys are the first people to see our top 46 list. So we can start at number 46 in Eric Sylvia, who's been in Erie. He was acquired in the Mark Canha trade, July. He's young for that level. He was pitched out of high school. Has like a yoga pose kind of thing when he puts his hands over his head. It kind of looks like Hidel Nomo when he was pitching. Fastball. It's got a decent slider, but he's a guy he's a little bit warped, but he comes in at number 46. And a lot of these guys we put 35 grades on, and we should explain the grades too, right, Chris? I mean, we should do that, like the 35.
Yeah, that's sort of borrowed from Fangraphs, kind of popularized the FV, the future value, and they put a number on it. And 50 FV is somebody who's going to be an average big leaguer, and a 70 is going to be a superstar, basically, and a 60, it's kind of along the traditional scouting scale, but you don't usually see an 80 or a 20. You get down to 35s, which kind of are, by their definition, they're emergency call-ups, which is I kind of think maybe who was the first baseman who played last year? I'm blanking on his name. Bly Madris. Yeah, Bly Madris or Brian Sammons. These kind of guys who you can get up and you can get away with them in the big leagues for a little bit, but they're not going to be, generally speaking, contributors to a championship level club. And so we just, like I said, we included a bunch of these guys just because of the way we voted. And I think I had to look to see how we graded these out. Looking. Shoot, I don't have that right now, but I think the bottom. Oh yeah, I've got it now. Okay, so the bottom dozen guys, 10 guys on our list are all listed as 35 FVs. We're basically considering them emergency call-ups. So I don't know if we have to spend much time on each one of them. We could just kind of rattle them off, and if there's any name that perks your ears up, we'd be happy to talk about them.
Yeah, let's do it that way. So at number 45 comes in is Andrew Sears, another example of scouting in the Northeast. He's a guy who was in Lakeland last year.
Left-handed pitcher out of UConn, yeah.
10th round draft pick. Another from the 2023 draft in the 8th round, number 44, Jank Diaz, who we haven't seen a lot of, but he is a guy who's got some good raw tools, and he's been injured. He's been nicked up a little bit. Coming in at number 43 is Max Elba, who got some time last year at West Michigan, undrafted free agent. That's a good example of a scouting relationship there. The Tigers took a chance on him,
And
undrafted free agent in 2022.
and I'll just pop in with
Yeah.
Alba's kind of an example of the modern kind of analytics or whatever, giving a guy a chance that it wouldn't have before, because his fastball is 91, 93. He'll top out at 94, but it's got a tremendous amount of spin and carry to it. His fastball has 2,650 RPMs, which is about as high as you'll see in professional baseball, and it's got 19, 20, 21 inches of induced vertical break. So it's a very, it doesn't drop as much as you would expect. So just guys like that kind of slipped through the cracks before. They're like, well, this is interesting. Let's see what we can do with this. And who knows? He's probably a middle reliever at best, but just another example of kind of finding little edges when they can.
Yeah, and he is a guy similar to another guy on our list too. That at number 37, Yolbear Sanchez. I want to mention him real quick because that was a guy who they scouted from another organization and has contributed pretty quickly as well. Number 41, or excuse me, 42 was Trey Cruz, who we mentioned earlier. 3rd round draft pick in the 2020 draft. Number 41, Chase Lee, who is now on the 40-man roster, who the Tigers picked up from in the Andrew Chafin deal last year. And then oh, go ahead, Chris.
I just, Chase Lee's, since he's on the 40-man roster, just give him a quick second. He's the guy they got from Texas, and he's basically almost a submariner, a side armor, and it's. I think I talked to these guys. I kind of treat like knuckleballers. Like, you don't really know if it's going to work at the big league level until you see him do it. But he had a really nice season, or partial season in Toledo after they acquired him, and they thought enough of him to put him on the 40-man roster. So he may be somebody we'll see this year, even though he scarcely throws a fastball above 90 miles an hour. But it's a really interesting look with a kind of a frisbee slider.
Yeah, it's always a thing with side armors too. Tigers don't really have a lot of those guys either, traditionally speaking. So I did put some scouting reports in. We have the photo feature, so I put in a couple of our. Although I just realized that Jake Holden, I didn't change the top 45 there, so it's my fault. Number 40 through number 38, Isaac Pacheco, who's still really young, but still, I think is a make or break year for him. Jake Colton at number 39, solid defensive first baseman guy at Erie. And Patrick Lee was a guy who the Tigers signed, and he was one of the few positional players that moved up 3 levels last year. He was kind of I think he has a case to be maybe perhaps an org guy, but he has really good speed, a very good arm, and really surprised a lot of people last year. It surprised us because every time I go to Lansing and see a game, there's always some sort of like fun surprise there, and he showed his arm and some really quick speed.
Yeah, and he's a fun story because he was at a Division II school with I forgot the name, but it sounded like a radio announcer name. It was like Paul Carey University or something like that. But and he was an independent league signing. They got him out of the Frontier League and brought him, and he was a contributor to Lakeland's run toward the playoffs in the first half last year, and he played 2 months in West Michigan and then was up in Erie at the end of the season helping that playoff team. So an interesting player. Don't know if he's going to hit enough, but he's got a bunch of other really impressive tools.
Yeah, and coming in at number 30, like I said, 30. I mentioned 37 in Sanchez, and the reason why he's interesting to me is because he's been able to already kind of, as far as like just come in there with 100 miles an hour stuff already, high upper 90s, and showing some really good quality control, good control already. And so I don't know, like the Tigers, it goes kind of like a throwback to what the Tigers used to do with international relievers. So that's why I wanted to mention him. And then I put those reports in our chat as well. So if everybody wants to take a deeper look, we have like the hit tool, the power tool, and all that there. Chris and I teamed up on these graphics to kind of make things palpable. These will be on our Instagram at some point or what have you. But everybody loves visuals, and so number 36 is Elizer Alfonso, whose father played for the Rockies, I believe. Chris? Yeah.
And his dad's cousin was Edgardo Alfonso, who spent had a couple of really good years with the Mets. So it's a baseball family, and he's a catcher who doesn't really do anything great, but does everything okay. He's a switch hitter who puts the bat on the ball.
And then Jim Jarvis, as Chris mentioned, number 35. And he's kind of a throwback to also a little bit like the Danny Wirth, but better because he could actually barrel it up a little better. He just needs to get some more loft in his swing to develop more power, but kind of reminds me of the Danny Wirth type without all the super hype behind him as of yet. Number 34 is Tyler Matson, who was added to the 40-man roster. And Chris, here's another example of Northeastern signing, like similar to Jason Foley. Jason Foley was a relatively unknown from upstate New York, and Matson fits the same description.
Yeah, I mean, he's from Bryant, which I believe is in Rhode Island. And he's a guy that, you know, we're relatively low on him here. Baseball America had him as their 15th prospect in the system. But he was another guy who was added to 40-man, a pure reliever. He was dominant in 2023, a very interesting kind of nearly over-the-top arm slot with another super high spin ride fastball and a usable curve and a usable change. So a guy who could potentially be a setup man or even close at times if he stays healthy. He blew out his arm last year and missed all of 2024, but the Tigers apparently are happy enough with his recovery that they added him to the 40-man. So he's another guy we might see this year pitching out of the bullpen.
Yeah, he's got that stuff, and depending on how he does recover, I wouldn't mind. He could probably start the year. Toledo's bullpen is actually going to be pretty stacked. If it's what we talk about projecting, Chris and I have been talking about behind the scenes a little bit. It just depends on health, of course. Coming in at number 33, Max Anderson, who hit really well in the Big Ten, but Chris and I are kind of about him only because we don't sure what position he's going to play.
Yeah, and there are things about his swing that are a bummer. That's probably the most negative of the like sort of scouting reports I've written thus far for our articles. And you know, you feel bad about it, but you got to be honest, right? And he was their second round pick, I think.
Yeah.
The same year they took Clark and McGonigal, they took Max Anderson out of Nebraska, and he had hit like 410 with 22 home runs or something like that in the Big Ten. And he's got raw power, but his swing and his approach, basically he hits almost nothing but sort of line drives and ground balls to right field. And he's a right-handed hitter. And it just doesn't, I don't think that's going to work at higher levels. I think pitchers are just going to pound him inside. And you'll see he's fallen off a lot of public lists already because he didn't have a terribly impressive first year in the pro ball. And on top of that, the hitting, he's just kind of I don't mean to mean, but he's just a little dumpy out there. He's not like a classic athlete, right? And he's not terribly agile. So he's stretched at second base. He's probably a first baseman, but he doesn't have the power to project there. So you could make an argument he doesn't deserve to be on the list, but we want to give these guys a little bit of a wide berth here for possible adjustments because we've seen other players fix their flaws over the last few years. So that's why he's on the periphery of our top 30.
All right. And then let's just kind of breeze through these a little bit to get to the meat, the potatoes, if you will. Tyler Owens, who the Tigers picked up, comes in at number 30. I'm sorry, I totally skipped that. 32 and 31, both Tiger pitchers who they drafted last year. Michael Massey and Josh Randall. Josh Randall comes in at number 32. Michael Massey, number 31. Third round and fourth round draft picks who were really impressive in college, and so they have some good stuff there. Michael Massey's coming back from back injury. Tyler Owens, who was also added the 40-man, they picked up in a trade from Carson Kelly, got better. His numbers the last month in in Erie were really solid, and he really solidified a bullpen that was kind of a little bit. The Erie bullpen lacked an identity last year because they were going through so many arms, and they didn't have that. Unlike the year before, they didn't have a lot of call-ups from high A that were being effective, and so Owens came in at the right time. Jose Dixon. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to pop in because he's the third person that they added to the 40-man roster in the offseason, Tyler Owens. And he's fun. He's 5'10" and has hair down to the middle of his back and a big beard. And he was throwing upper 90s at the end of the year with a slider that's kind of hit and miss, and he's developing a bit of a splitter. But he's another, as I said before, with Madison and with Lee, he's another guy we may see pitch in the bullpen for the Tigers later this year.
And it gives them some more much needed depth because they need some more swing and miss guys too.
Mm-hmm.
Number 29, and this is more. So Chris and I have a philosophy when it comes to. I have a thing about unless I see the player play, I don't like putting players on the list high on the list because it's not that I'm trying to be snotty. I just want to see it from my own eyes. And a lot of times we see this in public, analysts where they'll see somebody else put somebody high, and then automatically by default they'll just copy and paste and go, "Oh, I think that guy's good too." I haven't seen Jose Dixon play coming in number 29. I did see his swing. I get why people are hype around him, but he's also 17 years old. And I just don't, I mean, to me, it's like Chris Rodriguez, who the Tigers just signed. And there's a lot of international fare to him. Great. But has he faced a curveball yet?
Yeah, no, and I think this is generally a good philosophy to have for us. It's like Raj said, when we haven't seen these guys, if we put them on our list, we're basically just taking everybody else's word for it and copying them. But he did have, Jose Dixon, he's a 6'2" shortstop, 6'2", 160 pounds. So there's a lot of growing that he could do. He may fill out into some decent power. He hit for a solid average last year, stole bases, made the Dominican Summer League All-Star team for whatever that's worth. So we felt like he was probably going to show up on some other lists, and you don't want to be kind of left out, I guess, if you will. Like if there's a guy that the industry thinks is a prospect, you want to at least have some representation there. And the people we've heard talk about him, we generally trust their opinion. There's another guy higher up on the list that we hadn't seen play either, really, that we moved up big time last year because of some of the reports we heard and from people we trust. And so it's a bit of a balancing act there. But yeah, it was just a guy we didn't want to leave off the list just because we hadn't seen him.
Yeah. So number 28 is Eddie Leonard. Number 27 is Justice Bigby. Number 26, and he's high on our list, and he's not high on a lot of other people's lists. And Gabriel Reyes, a lefty who came out of Complex League and really helped Lakeland last year clinch a playoff spot. Really fastball, mid-90s, but he's got a really good sweeping slider. And if anybody has a chance to look at, by the way, I should mention this on our YouTube channel. We have a video on a lot of these guys that nobody else has. So if you ever want to know what Gabriel Reyes looks like, I think he has a makings to be a back end right now swing guy reliever. I love to see what he can do at West Michigan this year, but I really like his arm a lot. I'm a big fan of him.
And I'll just say this little stretch right here, we've got like 3 or 4 players that I don't think anybody else has ranked. Maybe our buddy Brandon over at Bless You Boys has ranked him, but he does the minor league show with us, so we're all talking about these players amongst each other. But I don't think you'll see Gabriel Reyes on any national list, and I think he does belong here. He had really good numbers. He's relatively young, and the pitches look good. He may ultimately be a reliever down the road, but he threw a lot of strikes, and so they're going to keep him starting, I think, until he proves that he can't.
Yeah, and it's the same. Like for example, Wilmer Flores, number 25, comes where he was at one point top 5 prospect on our list, but he's fallen quite a bit because and this is where we get the critical side of things. He hasn't developed a third pitch. He hasn't developed that change up. And there's times, I mean, we've heard some grumblings too that essentially he thought he should have been in Detroit last year, and he kind of rushed his way back from injury. But he had to be consistent with it. And so it was one of those things where Flores, like I really thought at one point a couple of years ago he would be in Detroit at some point, but the Tigers are also not afraid to tell from what we've heard, and this is one thing that we've heard, that like the Tigers necessarily don't mind you doing things with other coaches and other drive line and everything, but they're not exactly a fan of it either. So Flores did have his own coaching staff, and we've heard some rumblings and conflicts about how they saw things versus that. And I think he's going back to the drawing board a little bit.
I mean, he's a poster child for the ups and downs of player development. We mentioned earlier he was an unsigned free agent in 2020. The year they only had 5 rounds in the draft. He was 19, 20 at the time, younger brother of Wilmer Flores in the big leagues, right? But he came out and didn't, he put some impressive numbers up in low A, and then went to the Arizona Fall League, and people saw some impressive things. And then he kind of took, I don't know, I want to say took it by storm, but he had an outstanding 2022 season where he demolished high A West Michigan and went up and was pitching very well in Erie, to the point where he became a top 100 prospect heading into the 2023 season, at least to MLB Pipeline and Baseball Prospectus. Yeah, I don't think he made it on Baseball America, but then he was just kind of middling as a starter in 2023, and then they seemed to transition him into the bullpen last year, and it looked in spring training like he had closer stuff, but then he just fell apart. He couldn't throw strikes. He was giving up runs left and right, and then he got hurt a couple times. And so, yeah, now he was on the 40-man roster and they removed him and then re-signed him. So who knows what's going to happen for him this year?
Yeah, and that's going to be, and that kind of falls into the next two actually, in number 24 in Gary Burhan and Jake Miller. Jake Miller was the only pitcher at number 23. Jake Miller is the only pitcher who moved up 3 levels last year, and he had after one disastrous Arizona Fall League outing, had one of the best ones. In 4 innings, he struck out 8, and he's a guy who, similar to Reyes, has a really good makeup of pitches. But I want to get to Burhan real quick because I think Burhan last year, he led the organization innings thrown. He's been working on a slider. I've seen some video. Of course, he has to get lefties out before he makes the difference, or rather get to the big league level. But I think Gary Burhan, to me, if I'm going to make a declaration here, maybe a sleeper prospect. I think he's a guy who has the ability to be based off his makeup or his pitching ability. I think he might rise up a couple lists this year. Burhan really had a strong year last year again, on a staff for Erie, where Erie the year before had their 3 or 4 established starters who we saw in Detroit. It wasn't the case in last year. Erie by default had 2 or 3 guys that are going to be org guys, if you will. But Burhan did a really good job of coming up from West Michigan and providing a solid difference.
Yeah, he reminds me in a lot of ways of Alex Faedo, who the Tigers just released, in terms of his kind of his delivery, and his best pitch is a kind of cutter slider. But yeah, he's one of the guys I think will have ranked that nobody else will, and it wouldn't shock me if he becomes a big leaguer.
Yeah, and number 22 is Lyle Lockhart Jr., who led the organization strikeouts last year with a sub 90 fastball, but he's got some really good split finger among other pitches he has. Number 20 is where we started kind of seeing more of our 40 future value being a more consistent basis. Brett Callahan, we mentioned earlier, really good strong arm, good speed in the outfield. Number 19, and now this is where the high school kids come in here. Carson Rucker, who we just interviewed, 4th round draft pick. He has not played a lot yet, but if you look at his size and makeup, Rucker is a guy who loves baseball, and this is another scouting relationship, philosophy there. And the question is, do you think Faedo was a failure of drafting, meaning he was overrated as amateur, or a failure of player development on the part of the Tigers? I think the Tigers did everything they could to max him out. I think they were trying to weaponize him more as a reliever than a starter, and I think he just couldn't stay healthy.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably call it a failure of drafting, but at the time he was actually considered kind of a steal where they got him, because I think they got him 18th, 19th, 20th, something like that in 2017. And right after they drafted him, he went out and had an epic College World Series run. He was outstanding. He was throwing 95, 96 with a devastating slider. And then in pro ball, the velocity was gone. He was 89, 92. And the slider was okay. And then they never really were able to help him develop much of a changeup. I think he was okay by the end. But yeah, I think to Roger's point, he kept getting hurt at the wrong time, and never really had a chance to establish himself as a consistent reliever. And I think even if you go back and look at the 2017 draft as a whole, it just wasn't a great draft. So I don't know, I think it's a little bit of both, but also, just one of those things where baseball players, you can't really predict how they're going to progress in their mid to late 20s.
Yeah, I mean, was his arm ruined by overwork in the College World Series? That could be debated.
I don't think he was one of those situations where he pitched against TCU, and I think he pitched against TCU again. But I don't think it was one of those things. I'm trying to remember if they brought him in to pitch out of the bullpen in the championship game. They may have, but I don't know. I don't know if it was an overuse. I'm trying to look at his college stats right now. So as a junior, he threw 123 innings. He threw 104 the year before. I don't think it was like a classic case of, as we talked earlier about Rice, throwing these guys into the ground. I think, he's just maybe at 21, 22, he was able to do things he couldn't do at 24, 25.
Yeah. You want to go ahead and take over from here, Chris?
All right. I'm sorry. What number are we on?
We're number 18.
18. Ethan Scheffelbein their third round pick this year, or their second round pick, something like that. A
Third round.
left-handed high school pitcher out of California. Really interesting guy. I think I'm higher on him than most. He stands out most, I think, just for his pitchability. He's got a couple good breaking balls, low 90s fastball, but he seems to be able to toy with hitters. And he's playing in, I think he was on Corona High School in California, which is absolutely stacked team. They're going to have 3 first-round draft picks this year, and it's considered the best sort of high school baseball in the country. So he's an interesting guy who I think could rise up list pretty quickly if he shows any increase in stuff and he pitches the way I think he can. And right above him, we have Owen Hall, who was taken the round before him. Tigers signed him away from a commitment to Vanderbilt. He's out of Oklahoma, I believe.
Yep.
And he's kind of the classic project high school pitcher that could really take off in a year or two. He's got a big arm. He's mostly low 90s fastball right now, but it's been up to 98 in showcase settings, and he's got a couple other pitches. And he's just kind of that lump of clay that has really good traits that you want to develop. And if they help him reach a ceiling, he could be a mid-rotation starter or better. So these are younger guys that really have a lot of potential, but we just haven't seen them pitch yet. So we're kind of hedging our bets. Right above that, we've got Joseph Montalvo, he was kind of the best prospect they got in their trades with the Rangers. They made 2 trades with the Rangers last year. We've already talked about Tyler Owens and Chase Lee. Montalvo's another right-handed pitcher, but he does just about everything you want except throw hard. He's a former shortstop, so he's super athletic on the mound. His fastball has nice shape and good metrics. He's got an above average slider. His changeup shows promise. He just was sitting 91, 93 and not really holding his velocity. But when we talked to Scott Harris, he said they didn't do anything to him after they acquired him. They didn't change him at all or put him on a different program. They didn't want to mess with him. So he's a guy that, I think they had plans for him in the offseason. It wouldn't shock me at all if he's throwing, 2-3 miles an hour harder this year, in which case he could be a really very interesting pitching prospect. Right above him, we have Ty Madden. Rogelio touched on him earlier. He's a guy that was a lot of player development went into him. He had if you look at his pitching mechanics from when he was at the University of Texas, they're drastically different than they are now. He had a huge spine tilt. They've added, he put his arms over his head. He got a leg kick now, and they've added a number of pitches. He last year he started throwing a splitter, and it ended up being one of his best pitches when he got up to the big leagues. And I don't know. I mean, I think he's probably got a future in the bullpen, but he's a guy that they may continue to develop as a starter. And he was their second first round pick of the year. They took Jackson Jobe, I believe. So 2021.
Yeah.
And then number 14, we got another right-handed pitcher named Rogelio Castillo, who is kind of another guy that we're higher on than just about anybody else. And I don't know if Raj, if you want to discuss what you like about him so much.
Well, outside of his cool last name, I do like the fact that he also mid-season, just like a lot of these pitchers, learned a new pitch because he was primarily a sinker pitcher. So he had a very heavy sink, but he needed to become more of a strikeout pitcher, and those numbers started to reflect that a little bit towards the end of the season. And so what I like about Rainer is that the fact that for his age he was a really, and I mean, he had a decent Arizona fall league, but again, the fact that he was able to just go in and learn a new pitch and still learn to be more effective, it really, to me, it stands out that a guy that just came over from the Dominican summer ball become that effective after starting the year with even injuries. That's what I really like about Rogelio Castillo, and it's just a continuous the organizational philosophy of be able to change like that on the fly is impressive to me.
Yeah, one of the funny things about him is he began the year on the injured list because he had to have his wisdom teeth removed. So it's always a reminder that, like, yeah, well, these are just kids. But the most impressive thing to me about him is he's every bit of 6'4", 6'5", and 230 pounds. I don't know what he's listed at, but it's much lower than that. But the ease with which he throws strikes in the mid 90s for a kid that young and that big, he's consistently 94 to 96. And you'll see him ramp it up to 98 at times, and it's got a ton of sink. He's got a pretty good slider. He was developing the changeup over the course of the year. He's going to have to continue developing. He's not a big strikeout pitcher, and at higher levels that may bite him a little bit. But just given the size, the velocity, and kind of the aptitude for pitching at a young age, we're pretty bullish on him. Next up is Roberto Campos, who is we're actually, I think, probably the highest people on him now. I think a lot of people have given up on Roberto Campos for some reason. There's you may say that there's a bit of prospect fatigue going on here. You know, he was the big international signing in the 2019 class, I think,
Yep.
possibly, which was combined with the 2020 class, or no, it was the 2019 class, but then there was no baseball in 2020, right? Because of COVID, not in the minors. So we didn't really get to see him until 2021. And he's a big, strong kid, 6'3", probably 215, maybe 225. And it's just been kind of a slow development. He spent each of the last 2 years in high A West Michigan, and people just, like I said, people just seem to have given up on him because he hasn't been putting up gaudy numbers, but he's making incremental progress. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff behind the scenes. I don't have the exact numbers with me now, but he was a guy who put up much better numbers on the road in the Midwest League than at home at LMCU ballpark, and which is one of the hardest places to hit in minor league baseball. And so I think that some of that is obscured, or some of his prospect stock has been obscured by that. But he may surprise some people some this year in Erie, or I guess he may fall flat in his face. We'll figure it out. But as we like to say, these prospect rankings are just a snapshot in time, and in 2 months we'll probably have a lot of different opinions about these guys.
Yeah, we do number 12. So number 12. I mean, Chris, we talked about him earlier, but he is. I'm not ashamed to say this, but he's one of the most exciting players we've seen in a long time, as far as like just from an international side of things, where you kind of have that kind of I don't want to say he plays with reckless abandonment, but
Yeah.
if you look at some of his times where he's like, we're talking about Ramir Monte. I can again. Come
So
on.
it's Frangerber Montilla. It's
Yeah.
FARANYERBER, but there's that Y becomes a J. Frangerber Montilla, and he was the guy I was mentioning earlier that we had not seen, but our buddy Jeff Ponce from Baseball America had heard, glowing reviews about him from what was essentially rookie ball in Florida. He was playing in the Florida Complex League, and they have access to the underlying data. Baseball America does. And so he was putting up really impressive exit velocities and not swinging and missing at pitches in the zone, and all the sort of things you want to see out of a young prospect. And he's athletic and plays a very good shortstop. And so he kind of exploded on the scene out of nowhere, was completely off the radar. And by the middle of the season, people were putting him in the top 15 in the system. And so that's been another really fun development on the international side. And then we got to see him. He got promoted to low A Lakeland at the end of the year, and it was like he hit a brick wall at first. He was striking out constantly. He looked a little bit overmatched, but then he was a huge key to the success they had in the playoffs. It was like a switch flipped, and he was getting on base, hitting line drives all over the place. And Roger was referring to, he's just super aggressive. There was we put a clip on Twitter. It's kind of hilarious that he gets, I think it's an infield single that he dodges the tag at first. He basically gets picked off, but swims around the tag at first base, steals second, moves to third on the overthrow. I think it's another swim tag, and then he scores on a 20-foot dribbler, where again he's just super aggressive. And it's I don't know. There's a lot to like there, but we'll see. Again, it's a young kid in low A.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of those like little league plays, because it's so crazy, all the stuff. It's a chaotic play there. Number 11, by the way, is Trey Sweeney, who the gloves there. Now the question is if the hitting tool can be consistent. Trey Sweeney, that play in Baltimore was one of the best plays I've seen out there. He's a gamer, and we overpassed a while ago Andrew Navigato, and and the reason why I wanted to mention Andrew Navigato when it comes to Trey Sweeney is the most common question we got last year is, well, Andrew Navigato, how come he's not getting called up? He hit 21 home runs, he hit 283. He got bypassed by Sweeney, who was only in the organization for a few weeks, and we were told, told us. I mean, he told everybody in the press conference that Sweeney wasn't going to get called up, but something changed. And I think it's because of the glove is better than Andrew Navigato. It's as simple as that. Yep. And so is he the shortstop of the future? Because that's going to be a question that's probably going to come up with that. Answer is I don't know yet. I think we have to have more of a sample size. I think he's a guy who can play defensively, sure, but I think the offensive numbers, I mean, he was with the Yankees and Dodgers, so he's been in two other organizations for a reason. So and the numbers even in the PCL, and a league that if no one, in case nobody notices, is that if you're hitting 360 or 340 in the PSL, that doesn't translate in the MLB level at all. Never does, because elevations or whatever the case is. So
Yeah, with Trey Sweeney, he hits the ball very, very hard, and when he gets it in the air, it goes very far. He just hits it on the ground too much. But the really exciting thing there is, and we don't know, he may not hit, but as Raj alluded to, he came up and played, by the metrics, above average defense at shortstop at a big league level, and that's incredibly valuable no matter what. And like, the Tigers have had their issues with Javier Baez because he's producing at historically low levels. But if you get anything close to 20% below major league average as a hitter, and you're playing competent major league shortstop, you're still valuable. And I think that Sweeney is certainly capable of that and has a little bit more ceiling. So this is one of those ones where you kind of, the floor outweighs the ceiling, because we've seen him do it a little bit at the big league level.
yeah, it begins our top 10. Jaden Ham, we mentioned before, 5th round draft pick, our minor league pitcher of the year because the way he controls the top of the strike zone. And he's just a guy who I love his delivery, just kind of over the top. Number 9 is Troy Melton, AA, who he is a guy that there's better things to come. He spent his first full season, but he's a guy who's constantly tinkering. We've had a good conversation with him. He's got big arm, big size to him, and Baseball America, like Jeff Pontus, who we've talked to, was also really big on him early on, and he kind of tipped us off a little bit about Melton. Number 8, Jace Young. Now the question is if he's going to be playing third or not. Depends what the Tigers do the next couple days here, or the Alex Bregman sweepstakes is over with. He has the power to do so, and he played last year injured. I don't. If you're going to ask me on the spot if he could play third long term, I don't think so. I just don't think he has the left to right or the. I don't want to say. I don't think he has the range to play third. I just don't think so. He's a good second baseman, but just don't think he will play third.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the arm is stretched there, and he lacks the agility. And he's a guy who really controls the strike zone pretty well. He's not going to chase much. He can be beaten in the strike zone, which is not ideal, but you saw he put up like a 15-16% walk rate with the Tigers last year. He just didn't hit a home run, and some of that is he had a wrist injury that required surgery after the season. So we'll see what his power looks like this year. But I don't know. I mentioned earlier, he was a consensus top 100 prospect last year and fell off all the lists after coming up to the big leagues. I think part of that was just being so bad on defense at third base. And then so number 7 is Bryce Rayner. This is kind of another one of those situations where we haven't seen him play. He was the Tigers' first round pick last year. Shortstop, big kid, 6'3", 190, super athletic family. When we were down there when he was introduced to the team, and like his brother and his dad and his mom are all at least 6 feet tall. It's kind of crazy. So he might end up growing some more, but haven't seen him play. But a lot of the scouting reports on him were very impressive. And then we get into our top 6 who we talked before. This is kind of a consensus. There is a consensus top 6 100 prospects for the Tigers, although one of ours is not in that consensus. And we have number 6 is Tyron Lorenzo, who was the catcher / first baseman they acquired from the Dodgers in the Jack Flaherty deal. And people were down on that because he was hitting 220, I think, at the time when the Tigers acquired him in high A. And he went absolutely bonkers after the Tigers got him. They made some slight adjustments to his swing, and he took off. And that continued on into the Arizona Fall League, where he hit the eventual game-winning home run in the Fall Stars game, and it's one of the most majestic, impressive home runs you'll ever see. It's on there on Twitter if you want to look for it. Just an absolute bomb. And so you're talking about a switch-hitting catcher with plus power who doesn't leave the zone. He walks a bunch. He may strike out a little bit, but the reviews on him as a catcher too got better. So he's a guy who might climb into the top 25 by the middle of the season if he keeps producing like he did last year. He's going to go to AA this year, and yeah, that's an exciting young prospect.
And number 5, Jose Briseño. This is a funny story because Jeff Pontus was low on Briseño, and Chris and I were both high on him. And all of a sudden it turned. But Briseño has been working on his swing mechanics, and he hit a triple crown for the Arizona Fall League. So Briseño is going to be primarily a first baseman. He's not going to play catcher because of the knee injury he had, and that's okay. And I expect Briseño to have a really good year this year in high A. He might see some time in Erie at some point, but number 4 is we want to save because I know we only have a few minutes, but Hyu Lee. Now Hyu Lee was young for his level Double A. He literally put the Seawolves offensively on his back. And his numbers were very similar to Colt Keefe's numbers, except for Colt Keefe had a few more home runs in terms of WRC plus, batting average. He had a bad back, and he got hit twice in a span of 2 weeks, and it derailed his season a little bit. So maybe that's why, but we don't understand it. I mean, to me, Hyu Lee did everything. He plays a solid second base. Third base, he's got the arm for it, but it's just the range is kind of limited. But we can, I would need more of a sample size for that. But Hyu Lee, for his age, did really well last year, and I that was the one we were just kind of scratching our heads about. And in talking to Scott Harris privately and talking to him at the end of the season press conference, they're miffed.
Yeah, I mean, and now this Hyu Lee is the guy they got from Philadelphia for Michael Lorenzen at the trade deadline 2 years ago, and as Raj said, you know, for a kid his age, he performed really well. And you don't want to make it completely about performance, but it's still noteworthy that as a 21-year-old in Double A, he put up a 141 WRC plus. So he's 41% better than the average hitter at that level. And you can go on Fangraphs and search since 2006 for all the 21-year-olds at the Double A level who have a 140 WRC plus or better, and there's fewer than 25 of them, and they're all big leaguers. And you know, some better than others. You've got Mike Trout and Jock Peterson, Evan Longoria at the top, and other guys like you know, Rowdy Tellez, who maybe don't excite you as much, but then he's a first baseman. And you got the fact that Hyu Lee is a middle infielder, solid at second base. He's got a little bit of speed. We think he could play third base with more reps. They don't seem terribly inclined to do that. But yeah, he just feels like he's a guy that the industry as a whole is overlooking for reasons that we can't really determine. And when we watch him, and we're not scouts, of course, but we analyze these guys and we see there's nothing really to complain about. He chases sliders away a little bit, but a lot of people do, and he generally stays in the strike zone, and he walks at a decent rate, and he doesn't strike out much. So we'll see. This is another one that'll be a test case for us.
Yeah, it was the same. Yeah, kind of like reminds me of Colt Keefe. We were really high on Colt Keefe before everybody else was. And then the top 3 go Max Clark and Kevin McGonigal and then Jackson Jobe. And so Clark and McGonigal to me are interchangeable. But what stands out about these 3 is Max Clark and Kevin McGonigal both have a future value of 60, which puts them at all-star level, right, Chris?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then Jackson Jobe's at 70. And we're not, okay, so we're not, okay, here's the thing about us, about 60 and 70 grades, future value. We're not generous with those. We see this trend where people are like, oh, yeah, he's an 80. No, that's ridiculous. To me, it's not even being gatekeeping or snotty. It's just, you shouldn't be generous with stuff like that. I think that you have to really earn it. And I think Clark and McGonigal both. What's interesting about Clark is he keeps changing his swing. And admittedly, when he first got drafted, I was just kind of, my immediate reaction was like, man, they had Wyatt Langford there. Yeah. But then when I saw, when they got McGonigal, and then everybody was like, oh, wow, wait till you see Kevin McGonigal. And then I saw him like, oh, okay. That's why it was pretty much they got really two starters out of this, I think, in the same draft, which is rare to see like that, especially for the Tigers. And so I don't like, I like, the more I see McGonigal out there, outside of just being this social media guy that he is, he's just a guy who we've seen this so often in Lakeland. He would just take the ball the opposite way. He's a good teammate. He's a good guy who knows the game, like the little things in baseball that you want to see. But when we saw him in Lansing, loud contact. It's a kind of a thing where you see that his approach at the plate, takes walks, and McGonigal's the same thing. Like what I mentioned earlier, just toying out there a little bit with that.
Yeah, this is it was interesting, because we talked about this an hour ago, right? That we 2 of us who made our rankings had McGonigal 2 and Clark 3, and one of us had Clark 2 and McGonigal 3, and they are, I think they are really close as prospects. And What we saw with Max Clark last year was he got off to a really slow start. And part of that was, again, his swing. He was hitting a lot of weak ground balls the opposite way, particularly against fastballs. For whatever reason, his swing wasn't allowing him to get a hold of those. And then over the course of the season, right around the middle of June, he really took off. He had made the proper adjustments, and he got, eventually got up to high A, where he played really well. And one of the most impressive things that, and Scott Harris told us this, was that he stayed on the field. He was healthy for the entire season. This is a high school kid who came up and played 115, 120 games. You don't see that much anymore with guys. A lot of them get hurt. They tire down the stretch because it's the first time they've done this. And yeah, I the way I keep talking about it is that I think Max Clark can become the sort of hitter that Kevin McGonigal is already. He just has to find his swing, and he hasn't found it yet. And if and when he does, then yeah, he's going to take off, because he's a true, above average to plus defender in center field with a good arm. He's a plus runner. He's going to give you a little bit of everything if and when he finds that swing. And if he does, he could be the best prospect in baseball in 2 months. But for right now, at least I'm speaking for myself here, because Rogelio had Clark too, and I had McGonigal too. So we're kind of not in 100% agreement here, but McGonigal's pure hitting ability is I touched on earlier, is just the best I've seen from a Tigers prospect since I've been covering this. And it's everything. He hits the ball hard. He doesn't swing and miss. He doesn't chase pitches out of the zone. He walked. I don't know the exact numbers. I'm going to look up right now if you'll give me a break, but I think he walked twice as much as he struck out. I'm looking right now. Last year, he had 46 walks and 28 strikeouts as a 19-year-old in A ball and high A. Just a tremendous, command of the strike zone. You'll hear people compare him as a hitter to Stephen Kwan, but he's got more power than Kwan does already. Now, of course, he's doing it in the low minors, and the big leagues is harder. But we've put out some kind of crazy comparisons. Like if he reaches his peak, you're looking at an Alex Bregman level hitter, possibly Jose Ramirez. He has more power than you think. He's an above average runner. So again, I'm not predicting that he's going to become that, but that's the ceiling of a player for him. And as we talked, Keith Law, I think in his little blurb said he's a guy who could finish his career with 2,500 hits. So we're not the only ones who are really high on McGonigal. It'll be interesting to see. He strained a hamstring at the beginning of last year, so he missed the first couple weeks, and then he broke his hamate bone, which is notorious for sapping power the following season. So he might not put up terribly impressive power numbers this year, but we think it's in there. Not 30 home run power, but he's a guy who could probably, in his peak, hit you 15, 20 regularly.
And then Jackson Jobe is a guy who probably might have a chance to make the rotation out of spring training. But as Scott Harris said, he's going to be fine. Because one of the questions that Chris asked about was his usage of a pitch, and Harris paused and gave a great answer. I think I have it on my soundboard. See if I can play it here.
I think he's going to be just fine.
I mean, for all his impressive stuff, and Max or Jackson Jobe does have that. He as a prep prospect, all anybody could talk about was this incredible 3,000 spin or 3,000 RPM slider that he has. And that's still there, but he's probably not going to use it much anymore. It's probably now his worst pitch, which is odd. But I've been most impressed with his aptitude. His when he came up as his first year in low A, it wasn't great. He gave up a lot of home runs. His fastball wasn't particularly good, and then he got hurt. And he came back the following year with the fastball had a better shape on it. His changeup had gotten dramatically better. He developed a cutter, and that was the year he struck out like 75 people and walked 4 or something like that. It was just complete dominance. And then we saw more of the same last year. He got hurt again. That's kind of the only real question about him. That was a hamstring, I think. So these aren't like arm or shoulder injuries. You're not really super worried about that, but it is something to keep an eye on. But yeah, he's got the mid-90s fastball. His changeup, I think, is his best pitch now. It just the bottom drops out of it. It was how he got his first strikeout in the big leagues. And in this offseason, he is kind of working on more of a traditional slider and an old school curveball rather than the sweeping slider that he had that just, for whatever reason, wasn't missing bats. Hitters picked it up out of his hand too soon. And but all that is to say that like he just keeps working on his craft and getting better. And yeah, I think he's got a very good chance to make the rotation. And we have a 70 FV on him, or is it 65?
We have a 70 on him.
70. We think that he's a guy who's got true ace potential. Actually have to go out there and prove that. But yeah, I mean, he could be like a number 2 starter relatively quickly. The comparison I like to use for him is Zach Wheeler, a guy who's just going to be out there and he could give you 5-6 different pitches. And yeah, we think he's gonna be a very good big league pitcher if he stays healthy.
No more wasting bullets, as they say.
Yep. Oh, Stuart Shea said, fellas, any idea where the Tigers are going to start Ken Serwa to start the season? Now it's Ken Serwa. If you don't know, he is the kind of the viral knuckleballer they signed. He went to a kind of a pro day there at Tread Athletics, which I think is a pitching lab in Illinois. And he threw, what the people are saying is the hardest knuckleball anybody's ever seen. It was 88.5 miles an hour or something like that. And he had some other pitches too. And the Tigers did sign him. We requested an interview to talk to him. We reached out to him, but I guess he's a little bit busy right now. But I would think that he'll begin the year in low A. And if he actually proves like the knuckleball, it's not just a gimmick and he can actually get guys out, then they'll probably move him relatively quickly. But they did sort of a similar thing a few years ago with a kid named Duque Abear, who was Nicaraguan. Is that?
Yeah, the team Nicaragua. Yeah,
yeah. He kind of blew up on the stage because he was in the World Baseball Classic. He struck out Juan Soto, Rafael Devers, and Manny Machado, I think it is, or I don't know. Just he was a 19, 20-year-old kid who had this outstanding changeup and kind of blew up. And they signed him, but he was younger, and they kept him in rookie ball in low A all year. Because he doesn't throw very hard. So that's, I'd imagine, where Serwa will be at. Who knows if the catchers will be able to handle him at all, or if he really will even throw the knuckleball that much. But he's a fun story at least.
Yeah, and so Duque, by the way, was denied to pitch for Team Nicaragua this month coming up, the qualifier.
Yeah, which was mildly interesting to me because I haven't viewed him as a terribly high priority for the Tigers. If that makes sense. Like I didn't think they viewed him as somebody that they really wanted to, keep reins on and develop him. But who knows? Maybe he's throwing harder, and then they think they have something.
Yeah. But yeah, the knuckleball is They also split that splitter too. There's a splitter too that's really nasty.
Yeah.
When you have Pitching Ninja do some video on him, that says something. But if anybody else has any other questions or anything, we have some remaining time. And we went through a lot, so
it looks like Gary. Looks like you're muted.
But we need to have a few minutes at the end. I promised Mitch, we could talk about our upcoming meetings. So we have like 3 minutes here if people want to ask questions quickly.
Yeah, thanks everybody for sitting through that.
Yeah,
we did break down about 40 prospects.
You guys did a great job.
Thank
You
you.
did a great job, even better than I expected. And I knew you'd be good. Well, if there aren't any questions, and I'm going to thank Rogelio and Chris, recommend everyone check out their blog, their YouTube, and their Patreon subscription. We do have a question here from Stu. Yeah, Dingler.
How aggressive will the Tigers be at getting some high-level catching depth? I mean, Dylan Dingler. So here's the thing about Dylan Dingler. We were kind of out on him. He had a couple rough seasons in Erie, and then he had a really great offensive year in Toledo last year, and he's always had that potential. We were going back to when they first drafted him. We were higher on him than Torkelson after seeing them both a handful of times. I think the main thing the Tigers care about with their catchers is do you catch the ball? Do you call a good game? Are you a good defender? And Dingler is all of those things. He's got a terrific arm, and I think he calls good games. And I believe he was catching for Kiter Montero's complete game. Maybe not. Maybe he was catching for the Brant Herter near perfect game. But I think they like what he does on defense, and anything that comes from the bat is probably going to be gravy for them. They have gone out and gotten a couple veteran catchers that we were projecting at Toledo right now. Thomas Nito, I think, and another kid I think he's in the late 20s, who was playing for the Rockies. But I think they're comfortable with him as a backup for now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He's still, catchers are always weird. Like we've talked about this before. It takes time for catchers to develop at the to the big league level like that. And he does. I know this much. He does call a good game, and a lot of Tiger pitchers really is a big difference when he was in Erie when he came back healthy. And I think that I think everybody around the clubhouse likes him. It's just now the bat has to play up a little bit better.
Yeah, it will help. It'll help his longevity in Detroit that they have Lorenzo on the way up. Because if they think Lorenzo can catch in the majors, then they're not going to go out and get a veteran. They'd be more willing to put up with Dingler for a year or so or two because they don't want to have a veteran blocking Lorenzo. Now, if they conclude Lorenzo can't catch in the majors, then that's different. Okay, I really, really want to thank you guys for showing up and sticking so long and for revealing. Here's a world reveal of your prospect list. The information was great. You persuaded me McGonigal is a better prospect than I thought, but you guys know more than I do about this stuff. And as I said in the chat, I appreciate you guys going out on a limb a little bit and ranking guys that other people aren't, because there is a lot of groupthink. There's a lot of bleed through on the prospect list. You can tell by how many. I mean, the excuse me, the really, really top prospects, there should be a lot of overlap, but you can't tell me that at number 67 out of a top 100, there should be so much similar stratification. But anyway, okay. Mitch and I are gonna talk for 3 or 4 minutes about upcoming meetings, and we'll try to have Rogelio and Chris back during the season, although probably they're too busy running their own show. So tune in, everyone, give them a hand. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, guys and gals.
Okay, so I'm going to tout our upcoming opening day watch party for the Tigers versus the Dodgers in LA. We haven't had a face-to-face meeting since before the pandemic, or since, before the pandemic. Last one was SABR Day 2020. So I encourage people to show up. Susie's Bar in Hamtown is this cozy little time capsule. Drinks are cheap. Everyone is friendly. I'd appreciate it if we could get 20 or 25 people out there to watch the Tigers play the Evil Empire Dodgers. And if it goes well, we'll do more of that during the season. That's March 27th, 7 p.m. Well, the first pitch in LA is 7:10 Eastern. I'll be there at 6:30. And Mitch is going to talk about organizing a face-to-face meeting in mid-Michigan this year.
So we've gone to the Lugnuts before, Lansing. They are the high A affiliate of the Sacramento, the Athletics, whatever, the former Oakland, former Kansas City, former Philadelphia Athletics as they meander across the continent and coming back. So they're we've done some stuff out there before. When I checked their promotional calendar on Thursday, they did not have that out. They had their regular schedule, but we have talked, Gary and I, about possibly meeting for when they honor the Page Fence Giants, their Negro League Baseball game, or when they do their induction to the Michigan Baseball Hall of Fame. Normally, the Baseball Hall of Fame, I think, is late June, early July, and the Page Fence Giants are usually, I think, May, but they kind of go back into June as well. So what we had done before is we meet out in this kind of meeting place, and Jesse Goldberg Strausler is their announcer, and he talks to us and gives us game notes, and we kind of shoot the breeze and we all sit together. And then I spoke with a gentleman yesterday with the Royal Oak Leprechauns in the Northwoods Wooden Bat League. Several years ago, they were at Siena Heights in Adrian, but they have moved the franchise. DJ LeMahieu is a part owner. He's a Brother Rice guy, and maybe the Tigers could trade for him. He would be cheaper at third than Alex Moneybags Bregman. But they said that they have a seating area. One thing is, they said, if you guys came down as a group, tickets, they would, they're trying to get groups there. So it's like $25, but you get a free drink and something to eat. And then we could sit together and be on field stuff if we wanted to. So I've never been there. I know LeMahieu's not as good as Bregman, but he's, you're gonna pay one guy $3 million, one guy $25 million. There's their standard deviation. We're doing okay.
Yeah, I'd rather have Jace Young, give
Oh,
Young. a chance.
no, I'm out on Jay Young.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we're looking at kind of doing a Detroit thing at Hamtramck, as Gary said, with at Susie's in Hamtramck, and then trying to do a suburban thing in Royal Oak possibly. And their schedule does not begin till the end of May. It's a college summer league. So it's like a May, June, July, first week of August thing, the Leprechauns.
Right.
And
If
then
you're
the
not familiar,
Whatnots-
I'm sorry, Mitch, I didn't mean to step on you.
Go ahead.
If you're not familiar with the Northwoods League, it is the second best collegiate summer league out there, second only to the Cape Cod League. And I just talked to somebody who sees a lot of Cape Cod League games, and he said the Cape Cod League is overrated. I don't think that makes the Northwoods League as good as the Cape Cod League, but he said it's overrated because so many of the guys just show up for a couple of weeks, to show off in that. So if we can, we'll put together a meeting at the Royal Oak Leprechauns, and hopefully we'll get enough people to do it again. They're reaching out to us, so that's a good sign.
Right. And so that way, that would get our people who are in the suburbs or don't want to drive down Detroit traffic or Detroit, whatever. Then Lansing will be more mid-Michigan for our Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, maybe Northern Indiana people like that. So I guess just find your emails and, there's no pressure. You just sit there and you put names to faces and you meet people and you shoot the breeze, and it's been pretty good. So I'm calling the Royal Oak guy back on Monday, and just kind of tell him like, yeah, we'd like to do something. They wanted like pre-ticket sales a month ahead of time. I'm like, nah, I think we'll just pick a date and we'll show up.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah,
Right.
and for Lansing, I got mini season tickets, so I need to swing by and pick them up, and I'll try to talk to Jesse, their announcer, or their vice president, and say, hey, do you guys have your promotional calendar out yet? So that's what we do. And if you can make it, you can make it. If you can't, sometimes we get free tickets from the lug nuts. If we have a
If not-
SABR meeting,
If not, they're quite reasonable. If you've never been to Lansing, it's one of the nicest,
Yeah.
most comfortable, well-run minor league operations there are.
when my kids were little in the 90s, we would go to games, and they go to the jump house. Well, then we spent about 7 summers traveling around the country to the east, the southeast, the Midwest, far west, to minor league ballparks. So my kids have gone to like 30 of them. Now they're all adults and out of the house. But they were always saying, Dad, this isn't as good as Lansing. I mean, it's really nice. And since they bought the land and the outside around it, you could walk all the way around. They've got some drinking things. They just changed their vendors this year. I think they're going more upscale with the food because the food was not good last year. But anyway, that's what we're going to try to do. And, don't. So if you get the email and we say we're going to be there at, 6 o'clock, just show up and let us know ahead of time if you want. But it's no pressure, but they're fun. So don't be apprehensive if you've never done face to face with SABR. You've always done Zoom or just read the email. It's fun. And I mean, the first thing I ever did with SABR in person was I drove to Kansas City for a Jerry Malloy Negro League conference with my family. I knew nobody other than the emails. And I got Phil Ross in the elevator talking to me, hey, this is the greatest group, and Larry Lester. And then I meet Gary. And so it's been really fun, just a natural group of people, regardless of gender, race, sex, age. The commonality is a love of baseball. So don't feel apprehensive. If you are, it's not, you're not going to regret driving to Lansing, Royal Oak, or Detroit.
Yeah. And on the opening day watch party, I'd appreciate RSVPs. You can email me. That doesn't mean you have to show up. Just RSVP if you want to show up and if you think you'll be able to. It's not like if you RSVP and you don't show up, there's going to be any penalty. But I need to get some idea. If we have enough people, we might do dinner, Polish dinner at the Polish Village Cafe a block away before the meeting. Okay?
And you can always bring friends. You can always bring
That's
people.
right.
Yeah. Don't
Yeah.
think that we're going to stop you and have some sort of secret handshake that,
Yeah, we do have a secret handshake, but you don't need it to get into meetings.
Yeah.
So, yep. All of our meetings have always been open to members and non-members. And so I should have mentioned that. Okay, well, thanks again to Rogelio and Chris.
Yep.
Thanks to Mitch. Thanks everyone who stuck through it, although it was an easy time here. It's not like it was boring and the information was great. Okay, we'll see you all. Hopefully, I'll see some of you on the 27th of March at the watch party, and I'll see some others of you later this summer. We will have a opening day meeting of the AL Central chapters again. I can't remember when I think that's the 24th, I believe.
Yes, 24th.
24th. I already sent out the email. I'll send out a reminder for that so you can join that as well. Our last meeting, I think we had more than 50 people from the 5 chapters. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.